Hello, my name is Ann Booth, and I'm going to talk today about a set of issues to do with women, work in the family in Southeast Asia. And the question I'm really going to ask and try to answer is Southeast Asia different? Now, we all know that Southeast Asia is a region that has considerable religious and ethnic diversity. And perhaps not surprisingly, researchers who've examined gender roles across Southeast Asia have tended to compare different countries with different parts of the developing world. Indonesia and Malaysia, which of course are both Muslim majority countries, they often get compared with countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Although in my view, such comparisons do rather tend to ignore the very different history of Islam in Southeast Asia compared with other parts of the Muslim world. The Philippines, of course, is the only country in Asia where Christianity, Roman Catholicism in particular, is the religion of the majority. And of course, it's the only country to have been both a Spanish and an American colony. So perhaps not surprisingly, the Philippines does quite frequently get compared with parts of Latin America. Those parts of Southeast Asia where both Hindu and Buddhist influences have been strong, and that's really a large part of Southeast Asia, from Myanmar in the west right across to Java and Bali, these areas are sometimes compared with parts of India, although in the case of Vietnam, comparisons with China are quite often made. Now, in my view, all these comparisons have some validity, but they can, of course, convey the impression that the countries, and indeed the different regions of Southeast Asia, are characterized by great diversity, and they really have little in common with one another when it comes to gender roles. Is this really the case? And what I want to do in this lecture is to explore the question using evidence particularly on literacy, on labour force participation rates, changing family structures, and female infanticide. Now, these are all topics that have generated quite a large literature in recent years. And so we'll come back and address them one by one in the context of Southeast Asia. First of all, I might say a little bit about the work of Esther Boserup. She was a Danish economist who in 1970 published really a path-breaking study on women in development. She looked at really the whole of the developing world, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America. But she argued that there was some evidence that the countries she classified as Southeast Asia were in several important respects rather different from other parts of the developing world. Now, her definition of Southeast Asia was quite broad, included Hong Kong, but not China, where in fact I think she had difficulty getting data. But she found that in Southeast Asia, as indeed in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, women took a large share in agricultural work, but in addition, they tended to handle rural trade and foodstuffs and worked in a variety of home industries as well as services. But she also found that women in Southeast Asia tended to be quite active in urban areas. In Thailand, she found that almost 40% of the adult women had jobs outside the home. And the same was broadly true in Burma. In Burma, the proportion was a little bit lower, about 1/3. And in Indonesia, she found 25% of adult women in urban areas had jobs. Now, she thought that was a very high figure for a Muslim country at that time. Now, you might ask, well, where do these figures come from? Well, Boserup made extensive use of census data And for Indonesia, she was reliant on the 1961 census. Her book came out in 1970, so of course the census for 1971 was not yet available. Now, Boserup's work got quite a lot of attention, and indeed it's still quite widely read today, almost 50 years later. Since her work, several historians have been looking quite carefully at the evidence from Southeast Asia in the pre-colonial period. Anthony Reid, a historian who's worked in both Australia and in Singapore, he found that in the pre-colonial period, and that was really the 15th and 16th centuries, he found that women tended to play a much more active role in Southeast Asia than in other parts of Asia, particularly in China, and indeed also in South Asia. He argued that, quote, they monopolized textile and ceramic production, shared agricultural tasks, indeed dominating in planting, harvesting and foraging. And most importantly, they also did most of the work in marketing and indeed in business. Now, Reid argued that high status men across Southeast Asia didn't really want to engage in trade. However, women faced very few constraints, even if they wanted to work largely outside the home, and indeed, in some cases, run quite large businesses. And visitors to Southeast Asia during the pre-colonial period often commented on the fact that women did seem to be much more active outside the home than was the case, for example, in China, parts of India, or indeed other parts of the world, even indeed some parts of Europe. Another point that got quite a lot of attention was that divorce and remarriage seemed to be quite common in what was known as the Malay world, the modern states of Malaysia and Indonesia. And even in the Islamic societies, the custom known as purdah was pretty much unknown. That was where women more or less before and certainly after marriage were secluded within the home. And this was quite usual in parts of the Middle East and indeed parts of North India. But again, it seemed in many parts of Southeast Asia, women were able to move quite freely outside the home environment. Another point that got some comment was that young couples, after they married, didn't always have to live in the husband's home. Now, that was very much the tradition in China and indeed many parts of India. And of course, you often had what was known as the tyranny of the mother-in-law, where the mother-in-law often made life very difficult and sometimes very unpleasant for the young bride. This was particularly likely to be the case if the husband's family thought that the dowry that the young bride brought with her was insufficient. And indeed, even today in parts of India, one still hears of so-called dowry deaths, where young brides are badly treated, sometimes to the point of dying by the families of their husband. So one had a lot of, as it were, travelers' tales, not just Europeans, but often people who came to Southeast Asia from parts of India and China. And many commented on the relative freedom of women. A famous quote that you often see is one made by Stanford Raffles. He was the Englishman that was governor of Java during the Napoleonic Wars, when the English controlled Java as well as other parts of Southeast Asia. Raffles left behind an extremely interesting book. He called it A History of Java. And in this book he wrote that the women are universally considered superior to the men. And from the common labourer to the chief of a province, it is usual for the husband to entrust his pecuniary affairs, that's his money affairs, almost entirely to his wife. The woman alone attends the markets, and she conducts all the business of buying and selling. It is proverbial to say that the Javanese men are fools in money concerns. And indeed a number of other British officials who, like Raffles, were quite familiar with parts of India, they also commented on the relative freedom of women, not just in what is now Indonesia, but also in Burma. Burma, of course, was a colony and part of British India. But British officials quite often commented that women seemed to be a lot freer and seemed certainly to be able to work outside the home to a much greater extent than other parts of India, particularly the northwestern part of India. And one had similar impressions from European travellers in Cambodia and Thailand. Well, what was the impact of colonialism? Now, of course, through the 19th into the early 20th century, colonial control was consolidated across much of Southeast Asia. The Dutch, the French, the English, and of course the Americans displacing the Spanish in the Philippines. Now, the impact of colonialism, the economic impact, was often quite profound. Trade links with the colonial powers, which were of course then rapidly industrializing countries, they grew rapidly, and among other things that meant a big increase in imports of commodities such as textiles. Now, this led to a decline in the native textile industry. This seems to have happened pretty much everywhere across Asia, including India, and indeed other parts of colonial Asia. This was often termed deindustrialization and got quite a lot of attention, indeed still gets attention from economic historians. But some historians have argued that this wasn't actually always adverse for women. The Dutch historian Peter Boomgaard has pointed out, well, it's true textiles, particularly from Britain, from Manchester, but also from other parts of Europe, including France and indeed the Netherlands. These textiles did flood into colonies across much of South and Southeast Asia. But women reacted by reallocating their time to other tasks, sometimes in agriculture, but sometimes also in industry. And Boomgaard and indeed others have pointed out that cheap imported cloth led to a growth in batik finishing, which became quite a big industry, particularly through the latter part of the 19th, early 20th century. And batik, which had of course been very expensive, really only worn by elite women, became a lot cheaper because it was made using cheap imported cloth and finished in local factories, but using the so-called chap, the stamp, which of course was much quicker and led to batik cloth being much cheaper. But at the same time, there were clearly some negative effects. It's being argued that the large European trading houses tended to displace many indigenous trading enterprises across much of the region. And that meant women were really forced to work very much in the village economy. By the early 20th century, we start to get some census and survey data which do give us greater insight into the role of women in the labour force in at least some parts of colonial Southeast Asia. Labour force survey was collected by the Dutch for Java in the very early years of the 20th century, in 1905. And these data have been analysed by several scholars, including Regan Fernando, Benjamin White, and others. White found that the size of the female labour force in Java was probably only slightly smaller than the male labour force. But a large part of the female labour force, almost 50%, was in what the Dutch called the residual category, not really adequately defined. And White suggested that most were family workers, in other words, not working for regular wage employment, but working within family-based enterprises. That doesn't mean that they were necessarily working just within the home, but it did mean that they were working primarily in small family-based industries, and that indeed was probably true for many other parts of Southeast Asia, including Thailand, where by the 1930s the government was conducting censuses and surveys, and it soon became clear from the results of these censuses and surveys that many women in Thailand worked in the agricultural sector, and smaller numbers were engaged in small-scale manufacturing and in trade. By the time we get to the 1930s, several countries in Southeast Asia were carrying out population censuses, and these give us very valuable insights into the structure of the labour force, and particularly the role of women. It seems from the evidence we have that there was actually considerable variation in women as a percentage of the total labour force. British Malaya, now of course by the 1930s British Malaya had a very large immigrant population, people who'd come to work in British Malaya from China and indeed also from India. Now, it seems that only about 19% of the labour force in British Malaya were women. Women comprised only about 19% of the total labour force. That was quite low, and indeed it seemed that not just the indigenous Malays, but also women in both Chinese and Indian households often did not participate in paid labour. Maybe that they had jobs within the household, tasks in the household, they probably did, but they were not always enumerated as economically active in the census and surveys if they were only working within the household. When we look at other parts of colonial Southeast Asia, we see that in Indonesia, women comprised about 26% of the total labour force. But that varied a lot across Indonesia. It was much higher in parts of Java. In Burma, women seemed to comprise about a third of the labour force, and almost 47% in Thailand, and 50% in the Philippines. Why so much higher in Thailand? Well, as I said, Thai women were, many of them were engaged in agricultural activities, and at least in the Thai population census, they were categorised as working, gainfully employed, if they were working in an agricultural enterprise, which was usually, not always, but usually an enterprise owned and operated by the family. The Philippines was rather different, and it seems that in the Philippines, a much higher proportion of women were working outside agriculture. Come back and look at the reasons for that in a bit more detail later on. Now, it needs to be stressed some of these variations that were found in the censuses probably reflected different definitions, different enumeration procedures across the region. But certainly, as I said, there wasn't much doubt that in, for example, Thailand, large numbers of women were active in agriculture. And as I said, in Indonesia, there was a lot of regional variation, but the figures for parts of Java, particularly central Java, seemed to be very high. Outside Java, it seemed that fewer women participated in employment, at least outside the household. Well, it was clear from these data that the extent to which women participated in the labour force outside the home did depend on a range of cultural and religious as well as economic factors. We have to bear in mind that at this point, colonial statisticians, the people who drew up and indeed conducted these surveys, they came from Great Britain, the Netherlands, the United States. Now, in all these countries in the early 20th century, the so-called male breadwinner family had become quite common. Indeed, the norm, particularly in countries such as the Netherlands. Indeed, the evidence we have for the Netherlands in the early 20th century suggests that only about 5% of adult women were employed. By this stage, certainly in most of the West European countries which had industrialized, the tradition really set in. Some people called it a middle-class tradition or a middle-class norm, that it was the father that went out to work, was the breadwinner. The wife stayed at home to look after the household and, of course, look after the children. Now, when they got to Java, and certainly when they started conducting labour force censuses and surveys, the Dutch were rather surprised at the evidence, which tended to show that a much higher proportion of women worked outside the home or were gainfully employed, to use the term that was used at that time. They were employed not just in agriculture, but also in trade and indeed small-scale manufacturing. The evidence which the various colonial governments placed on education and indeed literacy, that varied considerably across colonial Southeast Asia. In the Philippines, the American authorities had committed themselves to granting self-government to the Philippine Islands and indeed eventual independence. And to achieve these goals, they devoted considerable resources to education, both primary and indeed post-primary education, even up to the university level. And much of this education was in English. And by the 1930s, those enrolled in education comprised almost 12% of the total population. That was a much higher percentage than anywhere else in Asia, with the exception of Taiwan, which of course was a Japanese colony. After the Americans granted self-government in the Philippines in 1935, a very high proportion of all workers in government and indeed in the professions were indigenous Filipinos. Indeed, probably higher than anywhere else in Asia, with the exception of Thailand, which of course was not a direct colony. Most of those working in government were men, but women did work particularly as teachers, as health workers, and indeed as government administrators. Pretty well everywhere in Asia, certainly up till at least the 1960s, female literacy rates were lower than those for men. But again, there was a lot of variation. A census that was done in the Philippines in 1939 found that about 41% of all adult women, I think it was women over the age of 15, were literate. And that figure rose to 56% in the census that was done in 1948. That's just after the Second World War ended, when the Philippines, of course, was already an independent country. The census in Thailand that was done in 1947 found that about 40% of women were literate. Now, of course, many of these had gained literacy in the monastic schools, but increasingly, particularly through the 1930s and 1940s, they were also attending government schools. Now, these figures for both Thailand and the Philippines were high. Certainly in the Philippines, they were high not just in comparison with other parts of Asia, but indeed with much of Latin America, and indeed some parts of Europe, particularly parts of southern and eastern Europe, which had remained largely agricultural and where very few women were able to get access to formal education. So by the late 1940s, when of course international bodies like UNESCO were charged with increasing access to education across the developing world, they found that both the Philippines and Thailand did indeed stand out. British Malaya had quite low female literacy rates. For Malay women, they were very low indeed. Only about 12% were considered literate. Slightly higher for Chinese and Indian women, but still fairly low. And that reflected the fact that many Chinese and Indian families had come to work often as labourers on estates. The women were probably illiterate when they arrived, and certainly they got very little access to education after they arrived in British Malaya. Indonesia, the data on literacy are not terribly reliable, but it does seem that they were considerably lower for women than men. Although again, many people thought that in the 1950s they were higher than in other Muslim majority countries, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. Well, turning to the data on marriage and fertility, as I said earlier, over the years, many foreign visitors to both Malaysia and Indonesia commented on the relative prevalence of divorce. First marriages only lasted a few years, and divorce seems to have been fairly easy to obtain, and remarriage often followed. And some Western observers, colonial officials for example, attributed these high levels of divorce in Muslim Southeast Asia to the relative freedom and indeed economic independence enjoyed by women compared with, again, other parts of the Muslim world, particularly the Middle East and North Africa. However, there were costs. Most women, when they divorced, had to go back and live with their parents or some other relation. They would take their children with them, and indeed the husband apparently did not always support the children. This was particularly likely to be the case if the husband then remarried. Colonial governments, by and large, across Asia were very reluctant to interfere with native customs concerning both marriage and fertility control. Even where colonial officials were starting to worry about what they saw as the problem of overpopulation in areas like Java, for example, northern central Vietnam, they didn't rely fertility control, family planning as either possible or indeed desirable. They were worried that it would be opposed by religious elements, that it would, if they tried to introduce Western concepts of family planning, that there would be resistance, and this could lead, in some cases, to outbreaks of conflict. Now, by the early 1950s, most parts of Southeast Asia had, of course, gained independence, and the Philippines, Indonesia, Burma were all independent by 1950. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia gained their independence after the so-called Geneva Accords of 1954. Vietnam, of course, was divided into two countries, North and South. And what had been British Malaya became part of the Federation of Malaysia, which was formed in 1963. Singapore, in fact, only remained in the Federation of Malaysia for 2 years. Then it broke away to form an independent republic. So the map of Southeast Asia, which we're familiar with today, had emerged by the latter part of the 1950s. Indeed, by the end of the 20th century, most governments had achieved pretty well complete or universal primary education. There was also an increase in post-primary enrollments, but these occurred, or tended to occur rather more slowly, and particularly in urban areas. Rural areas were often left behind when it came to progress from primary to secondary schooling. Now, an interesting point, by the time we get to the late 20th centuries, we see that most countries in the region had achieved fairly close to gender equity in educational enrollments. And this was the case at all levels, even up to and including university education. It seems that if there were constraints on young people progressing, for example, from primary to secondary education, they weren't so much gender constraints, they were more to do with household income and indeed household location. If you were fortunate enough to be born in an urban area into a relatively prosperous middle-class family, then you were likely to progress through schooling and indeed get access to some kind of tertiary education. And that was equally the case for girls and boys. But for young people born in rural households, then it was more difficult. It was more difficult for parents to afford the fees associated with post-primary education. And there was a tendency for young people to drop out when they'd achieved primary education. And that seems to have been equally true for both girls and boys. Now, another important development in the latter part of the 20th century was the introduction of government-funded family planning programs. These began in Thailand and in Singapore in the early 1960s, and then in Indonesia after Suharto took control in the late 1960s. Now, up till that point, government policies had been pro-natalist. In other words, governments tend to take the view that it was desirable for people to have quite large families. Not surprisingly, that led to fairly high rates of population growth. Across much of Southeast Asia, population growth was 2 to 3% per annum. Now that, of course, meant that quite a high proportion of the population was in the younger age groups. When the fertility decline started to occur, as I say, first of all in Thailand and Singapore, and spread to parts of Indonesia, particularly Java and Bali, then, of course, there was a change over time in the age structure. You had fewer young people in the younger age groups. Indeed, in Thailand, numbers of children coming into the school system were actually starting to fall by the early 1980s. There were, however, exceptions to this emphasis on limiting family size. In the Philippines, the church, Roman Catholic Church in particular, was fairly hostile. And it seems that in some parts of Muslim Asia, although not everywhere, religious leaders were also rather suspicious about government attempts to limit family size. When we look at trends in labour force participation, we see that in the 1960s, many countries in Southeast Asia started to publish data on female labour force participation rates. That's usually defined as the proportion of the labour force over 15 that is economically active. And countries were publishing these data, usually derived from censuses or special labour force surveys. What they showed, again, was very considerable variation. And this was true not just within Southeast Asia, but across the whole Asian region. One study that was published by the International Labour Organization in the 1980s found that female labour force participation rates, proportion of women over 15 who are economically active, it varied from only about 3% in Pakistan to 83% in Thailand. A huge variation. Most countries in Southeast Asia tended to fall between about 37% and something close to half, 47 to 50%. But of course, there was a lot of debate about the reliability of these figures. Did these figures really give an accurate picture of women's employment? And it was argued in some of the Muslim majority Asian countries, certainly countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, and indeed in some parts of India, the official figures were really too low. Perhaps it was because the enumerator was a government official, often a man. Women were apparently often reluctant to admit that they were gainfully employed, even if they were doing tasks which did contribute to household income. Of course, now in the early 21st century, we've got a lot more data, again, from population censuses and from specialized labour force surveys. And again, the most recent, of course, are from the first decade of the 21st century. And they tend to show, again, a pattern of considerable variation. But in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore, it seems that about half, 50 to perhaps 55% of women are classified as economically active. In Thailand, there does seem to have actually been a slight fall between 1990 and 2010. But this seems to be very largely due to the fact that more girls are staying longer in education, secondary and tertiary education. And the figure in Thailand is still around 64%. When we look at the countries of former French Indochina, Cambodia, Vietnam and Laos, we see that female labour force participation rates tend to be fairly high, possibly as high as 70 to 80%. And there's been, again, quite a lot of debate about that. Some people think, oh, well, this is a socialist ideology, that, of course, to a greater or lesser extent, these are countries which still profess some form of socialism, and socialist ideologies always tended to stress that women as well as men should work. Another factor, of course, was the loss of men in the wars in both Vietnam and Laos, and particularly, of course, Cambodia, where during the Pol Pot regime, many men, particularly educated men, were either killed or forced to leave the country. And it's also argued that these countries are still today fairly low-income countries, and there may also be economic need. In other words, households need two incomes. And so from an economic point of view, it's necessary for women to work. There continues to be some debate about what's happening in Myanmar. Unfortunately, in Myanmar, no population census was held between 1983 and 2014. This was a very long period. Earlier censuses, which had been conducted in 1973 and 1983, they tended to show female labour force participation rates of around 50%, although some people thought that was rather too low. Some figures claim that female labour force participation rates are now much higher. But again, there's debate about the data, and until we have complete figures from the 2014 census, it'll be difficult to form an accurate picture of what exactly is happening in Myanmar. It's worth pointing out that if we look at the data for parts of Northeast Asia, particularly Taiwan and South Korea, they tended to have rather lower female participation rates than in most Southeast Asian countries, even when these countries were relatively poorer than they are now. That's led to some debate, again, cultural practices, so-called Confucian practices, which tend to stress that the woman should stay at home and play a role inside the home. Although all the evidence we have for China itself does suggest that in recent years, female labour force participation rates are quite high. There was an argument that was put forward by a number of economists, demographers through the 1980s into the 1990s, that as countries in Southeast Asia got richer, then female labour force participation rates may drop because there isn't the need for a second income. Well, that does not seem to be happening. And indeed, the economic need for a second income still seems to be fairly high, certainly in countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, and indeed even Malaysia, although female participation rates in Malaysia are somewhat lower than in Indonesia. It's quite interesting to look at the distribution of women workers across economic sectors in different parts of Southeast Asia. In Thailand, it still seems to be the case that quite a high proportion of the female labour force is in agriculture. In the Philippines, we see actually quite the reverse trend. A rather low proportion of women workers were employed in agriculture, and indeed, recent censuses have shown that almost 70% of women are employed in the service sector. This is much higher than Thailand, for example, and indeed much higher than countries in Northeast Asia, such as the Republic of Korea. Now, this high concentration of women workers in services in the Philippines seems to have persisted for quite a long time. There's been quite a lot of discussion as to the explanations. One reason seems to be that many girls who had obtained some education, particularly post-primary education, they tended to look down on agricultural work. I think it was, as it were, below their dignity, and certainly below what their educational qualifications would merit. So they sought employment in service sector work, which tended to confer a higher status, not perhaps always more pay, but certainly rather higher status than agricultural work. Another point is now many rural families in the Philippines have little or no land. Girls are really forced into non-agricultural employment simply because there isn't much opportunity for work in the agricultural sector, and often if there is work available, then it's taken up by boys or young men. An interesting set of issues relates to the role of educated women in the labour market. Now, a very high proportion of women workers in the Philippines were in, and continue to be, in professional, technical and clerical occupations. This is probably about 40% now. This is certainly higher than in Indonesia, or indeed in Thailand, when Thailand was at a similar level of per capita GDP. Boserup, in her well-known study, also commented on the high proportion of women workers in professional, technical and clerical occupations of the Philippines. She attributed it to the much better education that the Philippines had experienced, particularly in the American period. And it seems that women have continued to make progress in participation in the so-called white-collar occupations in the Philippines since the country achieved independence. That also seems to have been the case in Indonesia. But there are some problems in Indonesia. It does seem that women with post-primary education do have difficulties in the labour market. They have higher rates of unemployment than men. And also it seems they're more likely to drop out of the labour force altogether. Quite recent figures for Indonesia show that female unemployment was still a lot higher than male unemployment. And women workers with lower and upper secondary qualifications seem to have particular difficulty in getting work. It's not quite clear what explains this. It's likely to be the case, again, as in the Philippines, that young women in Indonesia with secondary education often don't want to work in agriculture or even in jobs such as trading. They look for, as it were, white-collar jobs, clerical jobs, for example, shop work and so on. But these jobs still seem to be in fairly scarce supply relative to demand. Now, with these changes in women's work and indeed in women's education, it's interesting to have a look at the impact on fertility decline and the age of marriage. And what we're seeing across virtually everywhere in Southeast Asia, and particularly, of course, the more urbanized regions, there's been a trend towards later marriage and fewer children within marriage. And this trend seems to be pretty much unstoppable. In several countries in the region, fertility has now declined to near or even below replacement levels. Thailand, where, as I said earlier, the National Family Planning Program commenced in the 1960s. In the 1960s, the average Thai woman was having 6 or 7 children. That has now dropped to under 2. In other words, to below replacement levels. And in future, to the extent the Thai population will grow, it will be entirely due to in-migration. And that also seems to be the case in Singapore. In Vietnam, which was later to implement a national family planning program, really only in the early 1990s, fertility has also been dropping very quickly. In Myanmar, where it seems only a minority of couples actually practice modern contraception, the sharp decline of fertility has been attributed to high rates of abortion and also to a growing number of young people staying single. It also needs to be noted there are quite high rates of out-migration among young people in Myanmar. Now this, of course, with the changing political climate in Myanmar, this may change. But it seems that to the extent that well-educated young people who've left Myanmar, to the extent they come back, they remain single, or if they marry, they certainly don't have many children. The Philippines does tend still to stand out as having higher fertility than any other country in East or Southeast Asia. Although even here, fertility rates have been declining. They've probably halved since 1970. What tends to be happening in the Philippines is that urban women in particular are accessing modern methods of contraception, and even if the Catholic bishops disapprove of this, it doesn't seem to be having that much impact on what urban middle-class women are actually doing. Certainly in the Philippines, it does seem that fertility rates are a lot higher in rural areas and particularly among poorer families. Another rather interesting trend that's been noted, again, mainly in urban areas, although to some extent also rural areas, is the rising percentage of both men and women who are staying single right into their 1930s. A study that was done in Bangkok some years ago, using the evidence from the 1990 census, found that almost 30% of women aged 30 to 34 years were not married. And this percentage jumped to 41% for women with tertiary education. Now, Bangkok was something of an exception. The evidence suggested that the percentages were lower in most of the other big cities across the region, but still increasing. And again, recent figures for Myanmar showed that 41% of women with university qualifications in the 35 to 44 age group were still single, had never married. Well, various explanations have been put forward for this. There's certainly a tendency in many Southeast Asian cultures for men to seek a wife with a lower level of education than their own. In the case of Myanmar, some people think it may have been related to the fact that girls, particularly those with higher education, they tended to seek work abroad, and even if they returned home, they had little inclination to marry. Whatever the explanation, it seems that the trend is unlikely to be reversed. The government in Singapore, of course the Singapore government is never shy about social engineering, and they decided some years ago that it was rather a shame that all these university-educated women were not marrying. So they really started to put quite a lot of pressure on university graduates, male university graduates, to marry other university graduates. And this policy, although it gave rise to a certain amount of mirth internationally, does seem to have had some success. Another issue that, of course, has had a lot of discussion recently, particularly for China, and indeed some parts of India, is what's often referred to as the problem of missing girls, the sex imbalance which seems to have been emerging, at least according to recent census data. More boys being born and indeed surviving till the age of 5 than girls. Now, Many people think that in China this had to do with the one-child policy, combined with a very strong son preference, of course is historically deeply rooted in Chinese society. What this encouraged parents to do was determine the sex of the unborn child using modern technologies. And if the unborn child was a girl, then the fetus was aborted. So this led to considerably more male live births than female. It was also argued that parents were much less likely to seek medical help if a female child was ill. They were more inclined to let the child die, and then that would mean in China they could have another child, hopefully a son, to replace the one that had survived. The evidence demographers use is basically the sex ratio among children from 0 to 5. Now, in China, it certainly seems to be very different from the, quote, normal pattern, if you like, the pattern in West Europe, where there's not much pressure on couples to have sons, perhaps a little bit, but really not very much. And it seems in West Europe, parents on the whole are reasonably happy if the first child is a girl. They may have another child. If that's a son, fine, you've got one of each. If it's another daughter, well, often parents are quite happy to stop with 2 daughters. And indeed, this kind of attitude does seem to be reasonably common in many parts of Southeast Asia. In Thailand, which, as I said, has had a national family planning program since the 1960s, and where it seems now most couples have at most 2 children, and sometimes fewer, couples don't seem to be too worried if the first or even both children are girls. It also needs to be stressed that in many parts of Southeast Asia, there is quite strong religious opposition to abortion. And both Muslim clerics and indeed Christian priests often strongly counsel against abortion. In fact, in the Philippines, I think it's still, strictly speaking, illegal. And that may be one reason why in the Philippines and indeed parts of Muslim Asia, people still have rather larger families than in, for example, Thailand. But it might also be the case that many couples now tend to regard girls as having economic value, indeed, perhaps more likely to look after the parents in old age than a son. Whatever the reason, it does seem that this problem of missing girls is not very common across much of Southeast Asia. There's been a bit of debate about Vietnam, and some demographers have said, well, Vietnam seems to be more influenced by Confucian Chinese ideas about son preference. But elsewhere, certainly, it seems that couples are quite happy to stop at 2 children, and they don't really worry too much if both are girls. Well, how can we sum up? Can we say that when we look at women and work and the family, the role of women in the labour force across Southeast Asia, there are different patterns from other parts of the developing world? Or does the sheer diversity of the region, in terms of colonial legacies, per capita income, religion, ethnicity, does all this preclude any meaningful generalization about gender empowerment and the role of women in the households and indeed in the wider economy? Well, I think on the basis of the evidence on female education and indeed female labour force participation rates, changing marriage patterns, and the obvious lack of any strong son preference, at least compared with China and at least some parts of India, there does seem to be some support for the argument that Southeast Asia is indeed different. Women tend to be more active in a range of income-earning activities, particularly activities outside the home. And that does seem to be the case to a greater extent than in other parts of Asia, and particularly South Asia. The growth in educational opportunities, which has occurred everywhere really since the 1950s, does seem to have led to a high degree of gender equity in enrollments. This has been again the case in both Muslim countries, Malaysia and Indonesia, and indeed Brunei, and in Thailand and the Philippines. Thailand, of course, being a majority Buddhist country, and the Philippines majority Christian. And this has certainly led over time to more women moving into what one might call the white-collar jobs, professional, technical, administrative, clerical positions, although only in the Philippines have women achieved something like parity with men in these occupational categories. Now, of course, there are other important trends going on that I haven't discussed very much, but we need to bear in mind. For example, in the Philippines, this is a country that's been characterized by very high rates of out-migration in recent decades, really beginning in the 1970s and continuing right down to the present day. And it's often said many Filipino men with tertiary education tend to look for jobs abroad. Indeed, their families often invest in their education so that they can get work, obviously better paid work, in other parts of Asia or indeed other parts of the world. Many Filipino women with professional qualifications, particularly nurses and health workers, tend to seek work abroad. Now, this may account for the fact that it's easier for women who choose to stay at home and not move abroad to get jobs in professional, technical and administrative positions. They're not having to compete with men to the same extent that perhaps women in Indonesia or even in Thailand have to do. Now, out-migration is another very important aspect of labour force development across Southeast Asia. Unsurprisingly, what tends to happen is that people move often from relatively low-income countries or regions to higher-income countries or regions. And this is likely to continue and may also, over time, have important consequences for women's education and indeed women's employment. Well, thank you for listening to this lecture. There is a full paper that I'm quite happy to send you. I give my email address there, so if you'd like the published paper on which this talk was based, please just send me an email. Now, of course, there is a growing literature on women and employment, changing family structures in Southeast Asia. The paper that I mentioned has a fairly full bibliography, but there's also, these days, a lot of material you can download from the internet. If you're listening to this in Indonesia and you're interested in getting more information, I'd suggest you go to the Central Bureau of Statistics website. You can very easily access their website, and it has a lot of data, mainly from the Sakanas, the labour force surveys, but also from the population censuses on labour force participation by gender and also by sector, by age group. So you can download these tables and indeed, if you're interested, for example, in issues relating to female labour force participation, there's certainly a lot of evidence, a lot of data available.